Hello and welcome to Vertmode. In this series, we're going to take a look at building a simple game character. So I'm going to take you through the entire process of modeling, texturing, and rigging this character for games, and utilizing my workflow so you can see how this is done on a professional capacity and have an idea of how to approach this yourself. So I have some concepts here. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to start by just setting up a project folder and getting in and building this out. Now, we're going to do this in a couple of different ways. The first way I want to demonstrate is I want to demonstrate a workflow called the low to high workflow. And we're going to do that utilizing this character's weapon, where we build it in a low poly situation, and then we create the high poly later, so that way we can bake maps. And then for the character, we'll take a different approach, where we'll do a high to low workflow, starting with the high poly of the character, retopologizing down into the game mesh, and then baking these. We'll then UV these, bring them together, and create a texture pass. And then once we have our character complete, looking good the way we want, we'll go ahead and discuss optimizing it for games, reducing the poly count, creating LODs and light maps, and then we'll move into rigging, where we will make this come to life and be able to move. Lastly, we'll take a look at this in Game Engine, and we'll discuss how to present a game asset for portfolio. So let's go ahead and dive in and get started and kick things off by just starting with a project folder. Now, I am going to be using Maya 2026 for this. This is going to be my first look into Maya 2026. I don't really know what's new, so we might run into some hiccups, but this is a great way to learn and update is by diving in, creating a project. To begin with, the first thing I want to do is just set up my project folder by coming up here to File, coming to the Project window here, and just clicking New, which will go ahead and get a project folder going. And what I'm going to title this is just our tutorial game character. And I'll go ahead and set my location to my desktop so it's easy enough to find. We'll just go ahead and select that and accept. Now, this should hook everything up, and what I can do now is bring in my various images into here, into a reference folder. So let me go ahead and bring it down here next to our last tutorial's assets. We're going to put these into the source images. We'll go ahead and create a new folder in our source images here, and we can just go ahead and name this reference images. And inside of here, I'm just going to drag and drop these images so we can work from these. Now, you should be able to grab these in the link below, so check that out. The main one we're going to be working with is the Axeman concept here. If we bring this in, this should give us a good start point, and we should be able to start blocking this out and making our character. So let's begin with that. Inside of Maya, we can go ahead and bring in these various image planes in different ways. Now, you can take some time to edit these in Photoshop. Talking a bit about the concepts that you're given in the game industry, the most common concept you'll probably get in is something like this. Majority of the time when working in games, all you're giving is a 3/4 view that's been generated by an illustrator or even AI in this day and age, and you're kind of told go. Now, during the process, you'll often have a lot of back and forth between you and the art director in terms of editing this and refining it. So it's not necessarily going to look exactly like the concept, but generally speaking, it's a great start point. And what you're going to get from this is the major forms, the proportions, generally speaking, the color. But all that can change throughout a production, which means you need to be flexible when you're working and work in a way that makes it easy to adapt. This one I also have some orthographic views for to help us with proportions. These are not accurate, and that's something to kind of be aware of. It's always good to kind of check if the orthographic views are proportional. We can adjust them a little bit in Maya to make them a little bit more usable. So we'll kind of see that there. And then these ones are some context shots to kind of see how this meshes into the world and how other elements might look. And we might make some of these later for a nice presentation at the end. But for now, we'll focus on the character. So if you wanted to, you could come and slice these up individually in Photoshop. I don't do that. So let's go ahead and import this. Let's bring this into our front view here. We can just go ahead and come into View, Import Image Plane, Import Image, and we're going to bring in our Axeman concept. Now from here, it's good to move this to where its feet are on 0, 0 for something like the front view, if we're going to square up the front view here. And I'll go ahead and do that. You'll notice it's not the right size compared to the side view. We can make some adjustments on that, but something like this should work. The other thing we could consider is getting the size to be right. So for a standard character, like a male, we'd want this to be around 6 feet tall. We could do that by coming in here to our Windows, Settings and Preferences, Coming into our settings here, we could switch from linear to foot if you're a European. you might want to switch to one of the ones you understand. I'm in California. We still use the imperial system here, so I'm going to use foot. And once we have that in place, I'm just going to create a cube here, and we can actually use the cube scale to help us here. So the reason why I changed the units is because now that it's on feet, this is 1-to-1 with feet, and I could just scale this basically in Y 6 units, and this will represent 6 feet. From there, I can just snap my pivot to the base, D, and then V, and we can hit X, and we can snap that in here. And now in the front view, if I go ahead and look at my image plane, I'll use X-ray mode to see this. I can move the pivot of my image plane down to the feet of our character, and I can scale this image plane up to represent that 6-foot tall mark there. So now this character should mesh into our game a little bit better in terms of dimensions. And we can go ahead and repeat this process with the side view now. We can come in here with view, import image plane, import image, reference image, and we can just bring in our concept. And we should see our character. Now, if we don't like the direction this is facing, you can actually scale it in the opposite direction. So in this case, going depth-wise, I believe it's Z. So if I took the scale Z and we go ahead and set it to negative here, it should flip this. You can also probably do this in the image plane itself. Looks like Z didn't work. Maybe it's X. There we go. X is actually the one we need. And I'll just do the same thing. I'll move my pivot down here to be near the foot of our character. And then we'll go ahead and snap this here. Turn on X-ray mode and scale this up. And just make the head match. And head to foot, this should work out okay. They should be about the same size. From here, you can kind of judge that. If we just take these two, I'm going to use the isolate select here. We can see how closely they match, and they're actually matching up pretty close, all things considered. You know, it's not a perfect orthographic view, but it's good enough. I'm then going to push this back in the scene. I'm going to push this back in the scene, so that way we have these. And I do like to keep these in the perspective view, so I can be looking at them while we're working. When it comes to 3D art, it is important to view things in the perspective view quite often, especially for characters, because when you're working from drawings, they're drawings. It's not like a 3D scan of a character. So there tends to be kind of a range of accuracy, I guess you could say, in terms of how the character looks and what we're going to get out of it. So I'm going to take these here. I'm going to go ahead and just add them to a layer. We can go ahead and put this as our image planes. We can save this, set it to a reference. And if you want to keep things organized over here, you can too. You could take your image planes, hit Control-G. We could go ahead and name these our IP for image plane. And remember, we have this cube in here. I have the height here. If I wanted to, I could also scale it out now to match the width. And I could even scale it to match the depth. And we could think of this as kind of like our character's shape. Right? It's volume. So we could also name this volume cube, which will kind of give us a visual reference. And I like to do this especially when I'm working on like AR or VR projects, AR in particular, augmented reality. That needs to take place in the real world. I generally do it with objects though, and not characters so much. But something like that, you know, will give me the bounds, and visually I can make sure this is within these. Not really a big deal. Also, we're going to model to a T-pose, so I don't know if it matters that I have his arms in there. I might go ahead and shrink this down. I also might bring this just to the top of the head for the height. So we have that. But you could go ahead and save that if you want. We could just name this bounds. And what I usually do is set this one to a template and then toggle the visibility as needed. These cameras like to become visible. If you just select those and hit Control-H, they'll go invisible again. That's a good step to have for later when you go to export this. But now that we have our document set up, we can do a file, save scene as, and we can just go ahead and save this into our scenes folder as our character setup or character reference doc. Whatever you want to name it. You could even name it character 01. Not really important here. Now, the next thing to talk about is where we're going to begin and why. Generally speaking, if I'm building this for a video game, what I'm going to do is just kind of do an initial block out across the whole thing, get the proportions in place, and then decide the best way to approach it. Sometimes it's just taking it all the way in Maya. Sometimes it's bouncing back and forth between Maya and something like ZBrush. It all kind of varies. In this particular instance, we're going to start with the weapon. So what I'm going to want to do is just get the weapon set up, and I actually might want to set up its own individual image planes for that, which sounds a little bit interesting. But the main thing is I want to have a very clean way to get the proportions and form, and when it comes to doing this, it's not an exact science. We're not going for something 100% precise. We're just going for something usable. So I'm going to set my image planes off of reference here, and in these various views, I'm going to see if I can get a decent square on this. So I'm going to use the one of him holding it here because that feels more proportionate than the side view. Side view kind of feels like they shrunk that down quite a bit. So I'm just going to hit Control D on my image plane. I'm going to move it forward slightly here. And I can move my pivot by hitting D to be on the axe, and I might go ahead and kind of move it down here towards the base. And the whole point of this is we're just trying to get proportions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate this with the axe in mind, bring it here to kind of the center area, and rotate this to get this as closely as possible. Now you're probably thinking, hey, why didn't you just give us a pretty image of the axe to work from? And that's because I want to make this as real as possible. You're almost never going to get that. So you got to do what you can with it and try and steal the proportions where you can. All right. So we'll go ahead and use that for the front view, and I'll go ahead and name this front axe. We can go ahead and name these. So we'll go ahead and name this front underscore axe. And then we could even name the back one, character. I'll just go ahead and make it char front. And then we can name this one char side. So that way we know what these are later on. But we'll do the same thing with the side view now. We'll go ahead and take this guy, Control D, move it forward slightly so you can see this. And then we can play around with that pivot again to get it towards the base of the axe. So I'm just going to hit D, and then I used X there to snap to grid since we were kind of already there. And just kind of place this here on the side. And one issue I have is we're not exactly getting a front side view, right? I guess we really only need one view of this axe. So I'm going to delete this. The reason why is we only see this side. I'm going to model it from the front. I think that'll be a little bit easier for the purpose of mirroring. But there you go. We have our axe. We're ready to roll, right? So we can go ahead and save this, and we can get in on modeling this. Before I do, I want to talk about the process that game models generally take. So you generally end up with a low poly game mesh, and this is what actually goes into the game. Now, how low poly this is going to depend on the genre of the game. It's going to depend on the platform, but you end up with a low poly game mesh. And in order to get really nice looking high level details, we also create a high poly bake mesh. And these interlink. So the way this works is basically the low poly mesh gets the detail from the high poly through UVs and textures. But there's generally an intermediate one that I like to have in here, which is kind of the low poly mesh. So what is the low poly mesh? What's the low poly game mesh? The game mesh has been optimized to work in the game, whereas the low poly mesh is somewhere between the two, so that we can build the high poly from it and also reduce it down to the game mesh. So to give you an example, when it comes to RPG games and mobile games in particular, we wouldn't necessarily use a cylinder to represent something like the axe handle. We would more than likely use a cube, and the reason why is if you take a cube and you go ahead and soften its edges using a soften edge, from a distance, it looks like a cylinder. Especially once you get it into game lighting or any sort of environment light, it becomes somewhat indistinguishable. You no longer see that weird normal artifacting, and it works. Now, we're not going to do that right now. Maybe we'll do it ultimately in our game map, but we're going to go ahead and give it a bit of roundness. Now, when it comes to the roundness for an object, you want it relative to the amount of space it takes up on screen. And a good amount for something that's going to be kind of a middle-sized object, it's going to be, relatively small, but not small enough to warrant using a cube, is to utilize 12 segments on your cylinder. This gives us a nice medium point where we can reduce evenly if we need to, down to, 6 and then to 4. And it doesn't give us an overly large amount like 20, which is often too much to work with. So I'm going to start with a 12-sided cylinder here, and I'm just going to match this up to be relatively close to the thickness of this axe. Now I'm going to adjust my image plane a little bit more here to just kind of align slightly better here. And we'll just use this to create our shaft to begin with. I'll base it right around this area here. That looks good. And just kind of match the width the best I can. Then from here, I'll just take the vertices here, and I can go ahead and move this up to be the top of the axe, and move this down to be somewhere near the bottom of the axe, or at the axe base. And it'd probably be a good idea to model this on 0, 0 if possible. I could hit D and V to snap to vertex, and just X to snap to the base, and then just move my image plane down accordingly to make sure that we're getting about the right height there. So something like that, and I'll even move it over slightly. Now, as far as the base goes, you'll see me move the image plane around a lot. I'm just going to move that over. I'm going to insert a multi-cut tool here to create an edge loop. You do that with the hotkey Control if you're not familiar with that tool. You can also just use the insert edge loop. So now we have that supporting edge. If we go ahead and just highlight this and hit extrude, we can go and find the axes to pull this out. This one I need is actually the Z axes, and you'll see if I pull that out far enough, we'll just match that up. We could do the same up here. We could just find the top and bottom of this, and we can match this up. Now, something to be aware of is in this particular concept, that looks kind of square. But if we look at the other various concepts, you can see it actually has a bit of roundness to it. So I'm going to opt to just make that round, kind of like the axe we see on this one. I think that guy has a pretty cool looking axe. And just kind of match top, match bottom to get relative thickness here. And then, just like I did before, move the concept over a bit. So we have that thickness kind of matching here. And then just extrude these out. So we'll just grab the face, click extrude, and we can pull these out here. So that way we get something that matches. All right, so something kind of like that. Now, at this point, I may also want to play around with finding a better image for the axe, or maybe even just eyeballing how this axe goes. You can see it kind of wings off here and increases up. It runs along the top, runs along the bottom. There is sort of an indication that it may go higher here, which is also worth noting. That's something I could always add in later. For example, if I wanted to pull this ledge down, I could do that. And the same goes for the bottom. If that's something I desired from the base, I could also do that. I'm going to move those to match that blade a little bit more. And we can go ahead and turn on our symmetry here to World X. We can come to our side view here, and we could just select each of the sides that's going to make up the wings of the axe. Now, I want to make sure that I have this perfectly aligned with the axes here, and it looks like I do. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and pull this out. Now, we're going to want to think of the topology here before we do this. Game topology can be pretty rough, but what we're going to essentially want to have happen is the edges running like this from these side areas. And the reason why is when we smooth this for the high poly, it'll be a lot easier if we just have an edge loop that runs along here and runs along here. Likewise, if we have an edge running this way, that'll make it a lot easier for smoothing on the high poly. So it's still to be good to be conscious of that in the low poly mesh before we get into the game mesh. So I'm going to pull these out holding shift. That will trigger extrude, and then I'm actually going to flatten them with scale. And from here, what we could do is just kind of scale them up to match to that axe a little bit more, and just repeat this process. So I'm going to just shift drag. Same deal, if you need to scale in, and then match up. And I'm matching to this taller one on the side here. I feel like it looks a little bit nicer, so I'm just gonna continue matching to that. And you might notice this is asymmetrical, so I'm gonna start working that asymmetrically. If I wanted to, I could also kind of make the angle asymmetrical, but I think it'd be best if I didn't. Depends on if we want to match that axe blade though, which we might. I'm not worried about thickness right now. We'll sort that out later. I'll go ahead and do the same thing here. Scale this up. And at this point, we might be hitting our tops and bottoms here for this, where we can kind of get this in place. Now, we can also think if this is how we want to approach this. If we did want to get this blade in here, now would be the time to decide that. So how would we go about the blade? This would be the step to think about, is like here. You know, this is currently like this. It'd be a matter of basically getting this to be like this here. And we might want to do this I think this could be a better approach because this does have kind of a curve to it. So with that there, the approach we could play around with is basically taking this here and extruding this and scaling this inward to make this inner shape. And then building the blade around this kind of coming out. So something like this, for example. And if I go ahead and introduce a midline here on a multi-cut, and push this out here, that will probably help support this, and it gives us kind of the axe head shape. And what we could then do is take these here, and now we can extrude these. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a bit of a holding edge before this blade. Make sure you just have selected what you need. But now, if I go ahead and spread these, you'll see we get kind of that pause point, and I think that's going to play a pretty big role later on in getting this to look nice. And the other nice thing we're getting here is we're getting enough of these points here to actually come in and create the axe blade itself in terms of the roundness. So something like that is giving us the correct silhouette, the correct shape. We just need to kind of dial in and refine it now, and we also need to decide if that's enough roundness or if we want more. But let's go ahead and start with this, and we can decide some of those things as we go. If we want as well at this stage, we could add another extrusion here. Unfortunately, I kind of forgot this is all combined, so how we'd want to approach that is a little bit different if we wanted to do this. Normally, I would just extrude this up, but you can see since it's combined there, that's not exactly an option. We could kind of disconnect things and reconnect them here, which is also okay. Just kind of depends on what our goal is ultimately, I guess. To keep this simple, though, I think we'll just leave it like this. All right, so let's go ahead and come in here and continue shaping this. If I do want this to kind of come to a blade, it would be good if it tapers here quite substantially, right after this bladed portion. And as a matter of fact, if you're creating a low poly version for like the game mesh, we could probably weld these down all the way. I'm not going to do that for now. I'm just going to give it a little bit of a taper. We can always change that later. And we could even stagger these if we want. Then from here, what I could do is I could just gradually kind of scale these down as they go if we wanted to have that effect to the axe. So we have to decide, you know, does the axe head have a thickness like this where it comes and then it tapers, or does it taper gradually? These ones kind of show it tapering gradually, so I might want to experiment with that. It looks like I accidentally extruded along here too at some point. Let's not do that. But from the top view here, I can scale these in a bit, and you'll notice that we do need to scale these front ones in a bit, so I'll just do that in vertex mode. So that way we're getting kind of a gradual transition. We can come into this edge loop here, we can do the same thing, and then even here, same thing. And just kind of get this so it's not, you know, perfectly square. Something like that should look okay, and give us an okay result going into the high poly. So this is probably where I'd stop for the low poly. The reason why is this gives us options to go into the high poly, and then I'd revisit this before building this into a game mesh. But this should give us some nice topology, and then based on what our high poly gives us, we can modify this and we can make it look nicer. But we want to be mindful that we want to make that high poly before we really start altering this a whole lot. So I'm going to save this. We're just going to save this as axe low. I already have an axe 01 in here from a previous save. So I'll just make this axe low for now. Save that. So now that we have this low poly version of our axe, what we're going to do is we're going to name it just kind of axe low. We're going to Control D. If you want to, you can name this one axe high. We're going to be doing all sorts of stuff with it, so that's going to be broken. But I'm going to take the low. I'm just going to throw it on a display layer here and turn it off, and you can name that low poly. I already have one in here for some reason. Doing stuff off screen. So let's go ahead and save that low poly layer here, so that way we can toggle that on and off in terms of visibility, and we can just work on the high poly. Now the first thing I'm going to want to do with high poly is just kind of split this into chunks. So I'm going to take the wooden shaft here, and I'm going to separate this out. So I'm just going to highlight its faces. You're going to do an edit mesh extract, and what that will do is it will separate these into individual meshes. And then these two will still be combined. If you do a mesh separate on these, it'll make them all separate. And we want to do this for the high poly because we actually want to capture the interactions between the individual parts. So to restore the main shaft together, I'm just going to select both these together and isolate, do a mesh combine to combine those, double click my base, double click this base, and you can combine this a number of ways. I'm just going to go with a bridge. And then for the bottom here, we can actually move this down a ways into the interior here where this is going to plug in. We don't really need to add an end cap. It could be beneficial. Sometimes it helps with baking. If you wanted to, you could do a mesh fill hole to fill in that base hole. And if I go and isolate this by itself, we can see that a little bit better. And then the trick to this is just do an edit mesh poke, and that will go ahead and triangulate that just like the top. Then for this shape here, we can do something similar. I'm going to isolate this. We could just grab these edges here. We could extrude them inward. So that way we give this depth. You can then do a mesh fill hole here. So that way you get a cap. Then you could select that and you can do an edit mesh poke, poke that. And now we have that separate piece. And then for this area on the axe, all we need to do is bridge between here and here. And if we go ahead and do a bridge, that should connect the dots. Now for the high poly, one of the things we want to do is add in smooth bevels. So that way, instead of this looking super polygonal and hard, we get a nice rounded edge. And this has a very cartoony feel to it, so those nice rounded edges are going to work really well. We might also do a sculpting pass on this later, but for now, let's just get it going in here. I'm going to select all my various edges here. I'm just double clicking the edge loop. I can go ahead and take a look at this with this staff in place. I could bevel, add a segment. And if I press 3, we can see how those are going to interact. I could adjust the relative tightness or looseness here. And this is going to determine how our normal map looks, as well as things like our curvature and ambient occlusion. But something like that's going to give us nice smooth looking edges and a nice finish. We can do the same thing with the staff here, the shaft of this. One of the things I might do is I might grab these edges as well along the way here to just add extra support to where the axe haft is going to go into. And we can just take these ones. I'm going to look at the top here. We can bevel these. And you can kind of differentiate between wood and metal by making this a bit softer than some of the other areas. So maybe not going quite as tight on that top area. It'll give it a distinctive look compared to the hard metals. Now the axe blade itself is the more complicated one, and if we did our due diligence here, set it up right, it should work. So there's a couple areas I'm going to want to smooth along. One is going to be this edge here, so that way when we smooth, we get a nice hard edge. And then the supporting edges around the top and bottom, and then potentially the blade. I think for the blade, we can just add in an edge loop after the fact and get that working. So let's go ahead and take a look at this in terms of trying to get this to bevel out. We might have to make some adjustments, we'll see. I'm going to start with the edges that I want. I want these side edges, and these are very likely going to tie into these main edges here. So let's get those first, and then we can come along this area here, get our main axe haft area. And then I'm going to want to come right here, I think. And I might even want to bevel these edges. I'm not 100% sure. Sometimes it's hard to predict with the bevel exactly what we're going to want versus not want. We also might have to modify our geometry, but I'm just trying to think of the cross sections that these are going to create. And the nice thing about the bevel is if we don't like it, we can always undo it. I'm going to give these all a bevel, so they're nice and hard here. And I think we've selected everything at this point, thanks to symmetry. So if we go ahead and click that bevel, we can see the result it's going to give us. And that's looking pretty good. I might press the 3 button here to smooth and see how that's looking. And I think that's looking all right. So the main area I forgot to grab is those interior cylinders there. But as far as everything else goes, that's looking pretty spot on to what we were looking for. If we want a really sharp blade, I may want to change that because that's a pretty blunt looking blade. But it does give us nice thickness from a distance. I don't know if that's what I want though. So we might make some slight changes here. So I'm going to undo. The slight changes I could consider making if you want to get a really tight blade here is we could actually weld these down potentially. This does not always work. So I might end up undoing this. And this is why it's good to save beforehand. I probably should actually save before this even, especially since I'm on a new version of Maya and I might run out of undos. But the bevel gives things thickness, so there's a very good chance we can just double click this edge. Make sure we're not getting the center edge though. I don't want that. Just want it on those blades. And then I can go proceed to grab all the other edges I did. I'm going to grab the center ones this time, though, since I forgot those. And I'm just shift double clicking to grab these quickly. Shift double click will complete the edge loops for you and save you a bit of time. Just make sure you don't get anything you don't want. And then I'm going to grab these as well, since I determined we liked these last time, to get that nice little ledge difference on this. And we can click bevel. So I'm going to click bevel there, and you'll see it held up on the blade. I can give it 3 segments, so that way we get the nice base. I'm going to give it a tighter fraction to make it look more like metal as opposed to the wood here. And that's pretty good. So that worked. I did forget one thing, but you can see how that is giving us our nice blade there, which is exactly what I was going for. The thing I forgot is this here. I forgot to grab these side edges during the bevel. So I'm just going to undo to before then, and that should give us everything we're looking for. I'm going to give it segments of 2, and then just tighten these in here a bit. And there we go. Something like that gives us a pretty clean look to the axe and a really nice high poly result once we see it all together. One area I might experiment with here is this edge. You can see how we're kind of losing it right there, so that's kind of unfortunate. I think it'll be okay, though. It doesn't really bother me too much, but could be a little bit nicer, I feel. However, I think that looks nice. From the distance we're going to see it, it should work well, and I think we can call that good for our high poly and our low poly axe for now. So what we're going to do now is just kind of organize this, make sure I didn't miss anything, and we can compare this to the low and high really quick here to get a look. Now, one of the things I am going to change on my low poly immediately is I'm going to weld these down here to get the nice sharp edge that our high poly now has. Like I mentioned, it's good to keep the thickness just in case, but a lot of the times we are going to end up coming in here and just kind of collapsing these. That way we don't have to deal with a weird thickness. So that should look okay. The other thing I might check is just the relative smoothness between these two. And if I go ahead and overlap those, you can see our low poly is not really looking as smooth as our high poly. So there's a number of ways we can fix this. The only real way, though, is to be adding more geometry. Now, doing this by hand is a pain in the butt, especially when you're trying to match roundness. So what we can do is we can come in and we can actually grab these edges here along these center lines, and we can utilize the bevel tool to split these. So I'm going to grab all of these, come to my front view here, click bevel, and I'm not going to look at the inside. I'm just going to look at how these are forming along the sides here of our axe. So if I go ahead and just give that a max fraction, you can see that gives me more points and traces the curvature more accurately. I could also introduce another segment here, which might be beneficial, but I think in this case may be a little bit overkill. One thing that does stand out, though, is I did lose my center line because I did select this when doing the bevel. So I might want to deselect that one and just bevel the two on the sides. And now if I go ahead and give those a segment, that actually might justify adding a segment there. It's still not quite perfect for what I'm going for, but it should serve the purpose of adding some roundness here we can adjust. So something like that. Now, you also need to basically weld these down to turn them from being n-gons to something more usable, like triangles or quads. These center ones here should have merged. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So you can see this one, it didn't here. This can be a little bit tricky. What you want to do is just make sure you select that one and weld it if it didn't make it. So I'll use the target weld here, just kind of weld that back. For these ones, we could use a collapse on these to collapse them together. So I could select these and do an edit mesh collapse. That will collapse those together, and I can do the same thing here. Now, later on, when we make the actual game mesh, what we might find useful is coming down and merging these all the way. But for now, we're going to leave this be, because that may not be our best choice when it comes to doing the bake. Sometimes we need that extra geometry. Now from here, I can play around with the placement of some of these elements. So I'm going to move these back, for example, and I'm just going to get them to be a little bit closer to my high poly. Now you might be wondering, why am I not matching the concept? The reason why is because the concept was arbitrary to begin with, right? So what matters more to me right now is kind of getting these two match up with the high poly, so that way we get less discrepancy between them when we bake out our map details. So something like that should give me a decent look for the game mesh and a decent look for the high poly mesh that we have here. All right, so I'm going to leave these here for now. We're going to start blocking out the character, but this will give us a really good start point on the high poly and the low poly. For the high poly, I will delete the history on this, just delete the history, freeze the transforms on both of these, and just kind of perform a cleanup here. So we'll just go ahead and take these different pieces here that I have. I'm going to unparent them from this group. I'll just do a select hierarchy Shift P to get them out of that group there. And now I should be able to group these into a single group here for the high poly. I'm not going to edit this quite yet. There might still be some stuff I want to finalize before we bake, so we're going to leave this be. But I'm just going to take those, Control G, and just name this axe high, and we can go ahead and save this out. So I'll do a save scene, and we can go ahead and just make our axe low underscore high file. And we'll come back to this once it's time to do some texture baking. All right, so hopefully that gives you a good idea on how to approach this idea of low and high. We are going to work on the game mesh later. That's the final stage, like I mentioned, after texturing. But generally speaking, first step to making a game asset is you're going to make the low poly. You're going to keep it relatively conservative in terms of polygon budget, and then you're going to create the high poly. So what we're going to take a look at next is blocking out our character and then getting it into the high poly workflow, seeing how much of it we can do in Maya, maybe moving over into an application like ZBrush, and then taking a look at how we can start to rebuild that into a game mesh, as well as get this into a game mesh before texturing. Be sure to like and subscribe so you can catch the next video in the series when it goes live.